Hume was the kind of thinker who made other philosophers lose sleep, literally. Immanuel Kant famously said that reading Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers and forced him to rebuild his entire philosophical system from scratch. That's like saying someone's argument was so devastating it made you question everything you thought you knew about reality. And Kant wasn't alone. For over 250 years, the brightest minds in philosophy have been trying to solve the problems Hume created, patch the holes he poked in human knowledge, and somehow restore our confidence in reason itself. But here's the thing that makes Hume so fascinating and so frustrating. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He was just following arguments wherever they led, even when they led somewhere nobody wanted to go. He started with what seemed like reasonable assumptions about how we learn from experience, and somehow ended up proving that we can't really know anything for certain. He began with common-sense observations about how we make moral judgments, and concluded that morality might be nothing more than our personal feelings dressed up as universal truths. He looked at our sense of being continuous selves over time, and decided that the self might be nothing but a bundle of fleeting experiences with no real unity. The scary part: his arguments are still as sharp today as they were in 1739. Modern scientists with supercomputers face the same problem about induction that troubled Hume. Contemporary moral philosophers still struggle with his famous claim that you can't derive an ought from an is. Neuroscientists mapping the brain still can't explain what makes you over time any better than Hume could with his bundle theory. It's as if he planted philosophical time bombs that keep exploding in every generation. What makes this even more remarkable is that Hume wasn't some ivory tower academic. He was a man of the world who wanted philosophy to be useful, practical, grounded in real human experience rather than abstract speculation. He wrote essays on politics and economics, served as a diplomat, and was famous for throwing great dinner parties. His friends called him the Good David because of his warm, generous personality. But this sociable, practical man happened to possess one of the most ruthlessly logical minds in history. And when that mind was applied to fundamental questions about knowledge and morality, it produced conclusions that seemed to threaten the very foundations of human civilization. The responses to Hume reveal as much about the nature of philosophical problems as they do about particular solutions. Some philosophers, like Thomas Reid, said Hume's arguments proved that philosophy had gone off the rails and needed to return to common sense. Others, like Kant, accepted that Hume had destroyed traditional approaches to knowledge, but thought they could rebuild on firmer foundations. Still others embraced Hume's skeptical conclusions and argued that we should simply accept the limitations of human reason. But none of these responses has definitively solved the problems Hume raised. Each solution seems to create new puzzles or leave important questions unanswered. That's what we're going to explore in this analysis. Not just what Hume argued, but how the best philosophical minds have tried to answer him, and why those answers often fall short. We'll see how his ideas continue to shape debates in fields as diverse as artificial intelligence, cognitive science, moral psychology, and political theory. We'll discover why someone who died almost 250 years ago is still making philosophers uncomfortable today. And maybe, just maybe, we'll understand why some philosophical problems are so deep that they reveal permanent features of the human condition rather than temporary puzzles waiting to be solved. Welcome to the ongoing struggle with the philosophical legacy of David Hume. Part 1. The induction crisis that shattered human knowledge. Hume's argument about induction is one of the most famous in philosophy. but calling it famous understates its devastating impact on human knowledge. Bertrand Russell expressed the view that if Hume's problem cannot be solved, there is no intellectual difference between sanity and insanity. This is not philosophical hyperbole. Hume's analysis strikes at the very foundation of rational thought itself. It reveals that our most basic reasoning processes may be completely unjustified. The problem begins with a simple observation. We want to justify our belief that the future will be like the past in terms of our experience that in the past the future has always been like the past. But this is just another case in which we are trying to explain knowledge of some correlations now holding in terms of knowledge of that correlations holding in the past. How do we know that if in the past it has always been true that the future was like the past, then now it is true that the future will be like the past? We can only know this by assuming the uniformity of nature, but that was the very principle we were trying to justify. Hume divides all reasoning into demonstrative, by which he means deductive, and probabilistic, by which he means the generalization of causal reasoning. Hume argues that we cannot make a causal inference by purely a priori means. Rather, it is based on experience, and specifically experience of constant conjunction. But here lies the trap. If such an inference is made by a chain of reasoning, he says, he would like to know what that reasoning is. The reasoning must assume that instances of which we have had no experience must resemble those of which we have had experience. This assumption cannot be proven deductively because its denial involves no contradiction. Tomorrow the sun might not rise, bread might poison us, fire might freeze water. These possibilities are perfectly conceivable and involve no logical impossibility. So the uniformity principle cannot be established by reason alone. But neither can it be established by experience. We cannot know it directly by experience, since we cannot observe the future. A natural thought is that we can know of the uniformity of nature by experience, but without observing the future. By observing that in the past, nature has always been uniform. But this reasoning is circular. To infer from past uniformity to future uniformity requires precisely the principle we are trying to establish. Hume now argues that all causal principles are such that their denials are logically possible. Thus, if they can be known at all, they must be known only empirically on the basis of experience. Hume sets out to show no experience can justify these sorts of principles as necessarily true. Hence his skepticism about causation itself. The result is a complete collapse of rational justification for our most basic beliefs about the world. The contemporary significance of this problem cannot be overstated. Machine learning is a field in computer science concerned with algorithms that learn from experience. There's a well-known finding that learning algorithms are only effective if they have inductive bias, that is, if they make some a priori assumptions about the domain they are employed upon. The idea is also given formal expression in the so-called no-free lunch theorems. These can be interpreted as versions of the argument in Hume's first fork, since they establish that there can be no contradiction in the algorithm not performing well. Even artificial intelligence cannot escape Hume's problem. Modern philosophers have attempted numerous solutions. One possible response to Hume's problem is to deny that a priori reasoning could give rise to synthetic propositions. Kant famously argued in response to Hume that such synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. But Kant's solution faces its own devastating objections. There have been attempts to provide a priori justifications for inductive inference based on inference to the best explanation. There are also attempts to find an a priori solution based on probabilistic formulations of inductive inference, though many now think that a purely a priori argument cannot be found because there are empirical assumptions involved. The failure of these attempted solutions reveals the depth of Hume's challenge. A significant number of philosophers have embraced his conclusion that the problem is insoluble. This creates a fundamental crisis for human knowledge. If we cannot justify inductive reasoning, then we cannot justify science, prediction, or even basic survival strategies. Yet somehow we continue to reason inductively. Hume's solution to the normative problem of induction is that when we are confronted with a natural belief, a belief that comes to us as naturally and as inevitably as breathing, we are rationally justified in acquiescing in it provided it is not contrary to reason. But this solution seems to abandon the very idea of rational justification. It reduces human reasoning to mere animal habit. Philosophical folklore has it that David Hume identified a severe problem with induction, namely that its justification is either circular or question-begging. As C.D. Broad put it, Hume found a skeleton in the cupboard of inductive logic. This skeleton continues to haunt philosophy today. The problem of induction represents perhaps the greatest single challenge to human claims of knowledge and rationality. Part 2. Reid's common sense revolution against Humean skepticism. Thomas Reid stands as perhaps Hume's most formidable contemporary critic. The founder of the Scottish common sense school, Reid launched a systematic assault on what he called the way of ideas that had dominated philosophy from Aristotle through Hume. Reid's critique goes beyond mere disagreement with conclusions. He argues that Hume's entire philosophical method is fundamentally flawed from the start. This represents perhaps the most radical challenge to Hume's entire approach to philosophy. Reid contends that Hume's skeptical conclusions flow inevitably from false premises about the nature of experience and knowledge. Reid's central insight is that the representational theory of mind leads inexorably to skepticism. On this model, which Reid traces from Descartes through Locke, Berkeley and Hume, we are never directly acquainted with external objects but only with mental representations or ideas. Reid argues that this theory makes knowledge of the external world impossible in principle. If we can only know our own ideas, how can we ever know whether they correspond to external reality? Hume himself recognized this problem but drew the skeptical conclusion that such knowledge is impossible. Reid argues this shows the theory itself must be rejected. The problem becomes acute when we consider causation. On the representational model, external objects are the causes of our ideas. But if Hume is right about causation, then we can only infer the nature of a particular unobserved cause of a particular observed effect when we have had repeated experience of conjunction of similar causes with similar effects. But according to the way of ideas, we have never in fact had any experience of the relevant causes, namely physical objects and their qualities. We have only experienced their effects on our minds, our ideas. Therefore, we can infer nothing about external objects by examination of the ideas which they supposedly cause in us. Reid identifies three possible responses to this dilemma. First, one might bite the bullet and accept complete skepticism about the external world. Second, one might follow Berkeley into idealism, denying that material objects exist independently of mind. Third, one might abandon the representational theory altogether and embrace direct realism. Reid finds both skepticism and idealism unacceptable violations of common sense. He argues that the third option represents the only viable philosophical position. Reid's positive theory involves a radical reconception of perception. He argues that sensations serve to make us directly aware of real objects without the aid of any intervening medium. There are no ideas or representations that mediate between mind and world. When I see a tree, I am directly acquainted with the tree itself, not with some mental representation of it. This direct realism eliminates the gap between mind and world that generates skeptical problems. If we are directly acquainted with external objects, then knowledge of them becomes unproblematic. But Reid's critique goes deeper than epistemology. He argues that common sense provides the proper foundation for philosophy, not abstract theoretical reasoning. Common sense beliefs are those that arise naturally in all mature human beings, and that we cannot help but believe. These include belief in the external world, in the uniformity of nature, in personal identity over time, and in free will. Reid argues that any philosophical theory that contradicts these beliefs must be false, regardless of how sophisticated its arguments appear. The fact that a theory leads to skeptical conclusions is itself a refutation of the theory. This approach represents a fundamental challenge to Hume's entire philosophical methodology. Where Hume follows arguments to their logical conclusions even when they lead to skepticism, Reid insists that the skeptical conclusions show the arguments must be flawed. Reid feels he can refute skeptical hypotheses simply by showing that such hypotheses are no more likely to be true than the common-sensical belief that the world is much the way we perceive it to be. Since the belief in the external world is a dictate of common sense, it is as justified as it needs to be when it is shown to be on the same footing as any alternative. Reid's influence on subsequent philosophy has been enormous. His critique of the way of ideas anticipates many developments in 20th century philosophy, from phenomenology to ordinary language philosophy. Contemporary externalist theories of knowledge and direct realist theories of perception owe much to Reid's insights. Even Kant's transcendental idealism can be seen as an attempt to navigate between Humean skepticism and Reidian common sense. Yet Reid's approach faces serious objections. Critics argue that appeals to common sense cannot settle philosophical disputes, since common sense itself may be mistaken. The history of science shows numerous cases where common sense beliefs turned out to be false. Moreover, Reid's direct realism seems to conflict with scientific accounts of perception that emphasize the causal mediation of sensory processes. How can we be directly acquainted with objects if perception involves complex causal chains from object to sensory organs to brain? These objections suggest that Reid's solution may be too simple for the complex problems Hume identified. Part 3. Kant's Transcendental Revolution and its Limitations. Immanuel Kant described David Hume as the philosopher who awakened him from his dogmatic slumbers. This awakening led to perhaps the most ambitious philosophical system ever constructed, one designed specifically to answer Hume's skeptical challenges. Kant's critique of pure reason represents a sustained attempt to show how knowledge is possible despite Hume's arguments. Yet Kant's solution comes at an enormous cost, and many philosophers argue that it fails to solve the fundamental problems Hume identified. Understanding Kant's response reveals both the power of Hume's challenges and the desperate measures required to answer them. It also shows how Hume's influence shaped the entire subsequent history of philosophy. Kant's central insight was to argue that Hume had posed the wrong question. Rather than asking how our concepts can correspond to independent objects, Kant argued that we should ask how objects can conform to our concepts. This represents what Kant called his Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus explained celestial motions by making the observer move rather than the heavens, Kant explained knowledge by making objects conform to the structure of cognition rather than vice versa. This allows Kant to argue that we can have synthetic a priori knowledge about objects, but only objects as they appear to us, not as they are in themselves. This distinction between phenomena and noumena becomes central to Kant's entire system. Kant's strategy involves a detailed analysis of the conditions that make experience possible. He argues that experience requires both sensory input and conceptual organization. The mind contributes certain a priori forms of sensibility, space and time, which structure all possible experience. It also contributes a priori concepts or categories, such as causality and substance, which organize experience into a coherent world of objects. These forms and categories are not derived from experience but make experience possible. Because they are necessary conditions of any possible experience, we can know a priori that they will apply to all objects of experience. This approach allows Kant to answer Hume's challenge about causation. Hume had argued that we can never experience necessary connections between events, only constant conjunctions. Kant agrees that we cannot experience necessity in the empirical world, but he argues that the concept of causality is a necessary condition for the possibility of experience itself. We cannot have objective experience of temporal succession without applying the concept of cause and effect. Therefore, while we cannot prove that any particular causal law is necessary, we can prove that the general principle of causality necessarily applies to all possible experience. Kant's transcendental arguments attempt to show that skepticism is self-refuting. The skeptic claims to doubt whether we can have knowledge of the external world or of causal connections. But Kant argues that the very possibility of formulating these doubts presupposes the validity of the concepts the skeptic questions. We cannot even have experience of our own mental states without applying concepts like substance and causality. Therefore, anyone who has sufficient conceptual sophistication to formulate skeptical arguments must already presuppose the validity of the principles they claim to doubt. This makes skepticism incoherent. Yet Kant's solution faces devastating objections. The most fundamental concerns the status of transcendental idealism itself. Kant claims that we can know objects only as they appear to us, not as they are in themselves. But this raises the question of how we can even know that there are things in themselves if they are completely unknowable. Kant seems to make claims about noumena while simultaneously insisting that such claims are impossible. This appears to involve Kant in a fundamental contradiction. Moreover, Kant's synthetic a priori judgments raise serious questions about the nature of necessity. Kant argues that mathematical and scientific principles are both synthetic and a priori, extending our knowledge while being necessarily true. But contemporary developments in mathematics and physics seem to undermine this claim. Non-Euclidean geometries show that Euclidean geometry is not necessarily true of physical space. Einstein's relativity theory challenges Kant's claims about the a priori nature of Newtonian mechanics. If Kant was wrong about specific examples of synthetic a priori knowledge, this casts doubt on the entire framework. The majority of 20th century English language commentators have rejected the idea that Kant has a genuine disagreement with Hume over the status of particular causal laws. While Kant establishes the general principle of causality as synthetic a priori, Particular causal laws remain, as Hume argued, established by induction. This suggests that Kant may not have fully answered Hume's challenge. At best, Kant shows that we must apply causal concepts, but he does not show that our particular causal beliefs are justified. The problem of induction remains unsolved even within Kant's system. This limitation reveals the persistent power of Hume's skeptical arguments, even against the most sophisticated attempts to refute them. Part 4. The is-ought problem that destroyed moral rationalism. Hume's analysis of morality contains what may be his most influential single paragraph. In a brief passage at the end of his critique of moral rationalism, Hume observes that moral philosophers typically make an unremarked transition from premises linked by is to conclusions linked by ought. This transition seems to Hume altogether inconceivable. Few passages in Hume's work have generated more interpretive controversy or had greater impact on subsequent moral philosophy. What has become known as Hume's law, or the is-ought problem, continues to divide moral philosophers today. Understanding this problem reveals fundamental tensions between descriptive and normative claims that remain unresolved in contemporary ethics. The problem can be stated simply. Moral philosophers typically begin with factual premises about human nature, divine commands, natural law, or social arrangements. From these descriptive premises, they derive normative conclusions about what we ought to do or what is morally right. But Hume argues that this derivation is logically invalid. No set of purely factual premises can entail a normative conclusion. There is a logical gap between is and ought that cannot be bridged by valid reasoning alone. This creates devastating problems for traditional approaches to moral philosophy. Natural law theorists argue that we can derive moral obligations from facts about human nature or the natural order. Divine command theorists argue that moral obligations follow from facts about God's commands. Social contract theorists argue that moral and political obligations derive from facts about social agreements. If Hume is correct, all of these approaches commit a logical fallacy. They illegitimately infer normative conclusions from purely descriptive premises. The problem becomes acute when we consider moral motivation. Hume argues famously that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Moral judgments must be capable of motivating action, but reason alone cannot motivate. Only desires, emotions, and other passionate states can move us to act. Therefore, moral judgments cannot be purely rational. They must involve emotional responses or expressions of attitude. This motivational argument supports what contemporary philosophers call the internalist thesis about moral judgment. According to internalism, there is a necessary connection between making a moral judgment and being motivated to act accordingly. If I judge that helping others is morally required, I must have at least some motivation to help others. But purely cognitive states like beliefs can exist without motivation. Therefore, moral judgments cannot be purely cognitive. They must involve non-cognitive elements like emotions, desires, or attitudes. The implications extend to moral knowledge and moral truth. If moral judgments are not purely cognitive, it becomes questionable whether they can be true or false in any objective sense. This leads toward non-cognitivist metaethical theories that deny moral judgments express beliefs about objective moral facts. Instead, they express emotions, attitudes, prescriptions, or other non-cognitive mental states. Emotivism, prescriptivism, and expressivism all trace their ancestry to Hume's insights about the nature of moral judgment. These theories avoid the is-ought problem by denying that moral judgments make factual claims that could stand in logical relations to descriptive premises. Yet Hume's position faces serious objections. Critics argue that the motivational argument proves too much. If moral judgments necessarily involve motivation, how can we explain moral weakness where agents judge something right but fail to be motivated accordingly? How can we explain disagreement about moral issues if moral judgments merely express attitudes rather than making claims about objective features of the world? Moreover, the is-ought problem may rest on an overly restrictive conception of logical inference. Contemporary philosophers have argued that evaluative conclusions can be validly derived from descriptive premises when those premises implicitly contain evaluative elements. The debate over the is-ought problem reveals deeper questions about the nature of normativity itself. How can anything be objectively required or forbidden if the universe consists entirely of non-normative natural facts? This leads to what philosophers call the grounding problem for normative facts. Either normative facts are identical to or reducible to natural facts, or they constitute a special realm of non-natural facts, or they do not exist at all. Each option faces serious difficulties. Reductive naturalism seems to violate the is-ought distinction. Non-naturalism seems to posit mysterious metaphysical entities. And anti-realism seems to undermine the objectivity of morality. Contemporary moral philosophers continue to grapple with these problems. Neo-Humean approaches embrace the is-ought distinction while trying to develop sophisticated non-cognitivist theories. Neo-Kantian approaches seek objective moral truths grounded in the nature of practical reason itself. Naturalistic approaches attempt to bridge the is-ought gap through careful analysis of what naturalism requires. Yet none of these approaches has achieved consensus. The is-ought problem remains as challenging today as when Hume first formulated it, revealing fundamental tensions in our understanding of morality that may be impossible to resolve. Part 5. The Bundle Theory Collapse and Personal Identity Crisis. Hume's analysis of personal identity represents one of his most radical and problematic doctrines. His bundle theory holds that the self is nothing more than a collection of perceptions without any underlying substantial basis. This theory challenges our deepest convictions about the continuity and unity of personal identity over time. Yet Hume himself came to recognize fatal problems with this theory, leading to what many consider his most significant philosophical retraction. The failure of the bundle theory reveals fundamental problems with Hume's empiricist methodology and raises questions about whether any purely empiricist account of the self can succeed. Understanding these problems illuminates persistent challenges in contemporary philosophy of mind and personal identity. Hume begins his analysis with a characteristically empiricist challenge. He argues that we have no impression of a simple individual self that persists through time. When he introspects, he finds only particular perceptions of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. He never catches himself at any time without a perception, and never observes anything but the perception. If all ideas must be copied from impressions, and there is no impression of a substantial self, then there can be no idea of such a self. The self must therefore be nothing more than a bundle or collection of different perceptions that succeed each other with inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. This bundle theory has radical implications. It denies that there is any substantial self that persists through time and change. Instead, what we call the self is merely a series of distinct perceptions connected by psychological relations like resemblance, contiguity, and causation. These relations create the illusion of a unified, persisting self, but this is merely a fiction of the imagination. There is no metaphysical fact of the matter about personal identity over time. Questions about whether a future person will be the same as a present person have no objective answers. The theory generates immediate problems about moral responsibility. If there is no persistent self, how can a person be held responsible for past actions? The person who committed a crime yesterday may be literally a different person from the one who stands trial today. They may share psychological connections with the criminal, but they are not metaphysically identical. This seems to undermine the entire framework of moral and legal responsibility that presupposes persistent personal identity. Hume attempts to solve this problem through his theory of natural and artificial virtues, but critics argue that this response is inadequate. The bundle theory also faces the problem of unity of consciousness. How can distinct perceptions be unified into a single experience if there is no substantial self to serve as the subject of experience? When I see a red rose and smell its fragrance simultaneously, these distinct perceptions are experienced as unified. But if the self is merely a bundle of perceptions, what accounts for this unity? There seems to be no explanation for how distinct mental states can be experienced together without a unifying subject. This problem becomes acute when we consider complex mental activities like reasoning that seem to require a unified subject to connect premises and conclusions. Hume himself recognized these problems in the appendix to the treatise. He admits that when he attempts to explain the principle of connection that binds perceptions together, his account becomes very defective. He cannot explain how successive perceptions are united in thought or consciousness. The principles of association that he invokes seem insufficient to account for the unity and continuity of personal identity. Hume's candid admission of failure represents one of the most remarkable retractions in the history of philosophy. It shows that even Hume recognized the inadequacy of his empiricist approach to fundamental questions about the nature of the self. Contemporary philosophers have developed various responses to the bundle theory's problems. Some embrace neo-Humean approaches that accept the bundle theory while trying to solve its difficulties through more sophisticated psychological theories. Others argue for substantial selves or Cartesian egos that provide the metaphysical basis for personal identity. Still others adopt narrative approaches that ground personal identity in the stories we tell about ourselves. Yet none of these approaches has achieved consensus, and the fundamental problems Hume identified remain unresolved. This suggests that the question of personal identity may be among the most intractable in philosophy. The failure of the bundle theory also reveals methodological problems with Hume's empiricism. The copy principle that all ideas must be traced to corresponding impressions proves too restrictive when applied to fundamental metaphysical concepts. If we cannot form ideas of things like substantial selves, necessary connections, or external objects, this may show the inadequacy of the principle rather than the non-existence of these things. Contemporary cognitive science suggests that the mind actively constructs representations rather than passively copying impressions. This constructive view of cognition undermines the simple copy theory that grounds Hume's skeptical arguments. The bundle theory's failure thus points toward broader problems with the entire empiricist framework that Hume inherited and developed. Part 6. The causation critique that undermined necessary connection. Hume's analysis of causation represents perhaps his most technically sophisticated and influential contribution to philosophy. His critique of the concept of necessary connection has shaped debates about causation for over 2 centuries. Yet this analysis leads to conclusions that many philosophers find unacceptable. If Hume is correct, then our ordinary concept of causation involves a fundamental illusion, and science itself rests on unjustified assumptions. Understanding the problems with Hume's theory reveals tensions between philosophical analysis and scientific practice that remain unresolved today. These tensions illuminate fundamental questions about the nature of natural laws and the metaphysics of the physical world. Hume's analysis begins with his characteristic empiricist methodology. He asks what impression gives rise to our idea of necessary connection between cause and effect. When we observe causal relations, we see temporal succession, spatial contiguity, and constant conjunction. But we never observe any necessary connection that guarantees the effect must follow the cause. The idea of necessity is not copied from any external impression. Therefore, Hume concludes it must arise from an internal impression or feeling in the mind of the observer. This feeling arises from custom or habit. After repeatedly observing events of type A followed by events of type B, the mind develops a habit of expectation. When we encounter a new instance of A, we automatically expect B to follow. This feeling of expectation is the source of our idea of necessary connection. Causation thus becomes a psychological phenomenon rather than an objective feature of the external world. There are no metaphysical necessary connections in nature, only regular patterns of succession that generate expectations in observers. Hume offers 2 definitions of causation that reflect this analysis. The first defines a cause as an object precedent and contiguous to another, where all objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. The second defines a cause as an object precedent and contiguous to another, where the appearance of the first produces a belief in the second. The first definition captures the objective regularity aspect of causation, while the second captures the subjective expectation aspect. Both definitions eliminate any reference to metaphysical necessity or causal powers. Causation becomes purely a matter of observed regularity and psychological response. This reductive analysis faces immediate objections. Critics argue that it cannot distinguish genuine causal relations from mere accidental regularities. The fact that day follows night does not make night the cause of day, even though this succession is perfectly regular. Similarly, barometer readings regularly precede storms, but the readings do not cause the storms. Hume's regularity theory seems unable to capture the difference between causation and correlation. This problem becomes acute in scientific contexts, where distinguishing causal from non-causal regularities is crucial for explanation and prediction. Moreover, Hume's psychological account of necessity faces the problem of projection. Even if our idea of necessity arises from feelings of expectation, this does not show that necessity is merely psychological. The feeling might be a response to objective necessary connections in the world. Critics argue that Hume commits a fallacy by inferring metaphysical conclusions from epistemological premises. The fact that we cannot observe necessity does not prove that necessity does not exist. It may simply show the limitations of human observation. Contemporary philosophy of science has developed sophisticated alternatives to Humean regularity theories. Causal realists argue that science discovers objective causal powers and dispositions in nature. Laws of nature are not mere regularities, but express real constraints on how the world can evolve. Counterfactual theories analyze causation in terms of what would happen in possible worlds with different initial conditions. Causal process theories focus on the transmission of conserved quantities like energy and momentum. Each approach attempts to capture aspects of causation that seem missing from Humean regularity theories. Yet defenders of neo-Humean approaches argue that these alternatives face their own problems. Causal powers and dispositions seem to be unobservable theoretical entities whose nature remains mysterious. Counterfactual approaches require a theory of possible worlds that may be more problematic than the causal concepts they aim to analyze. Process theories work well for paradigm cases of physical causation, but seem inadequate for psychological and social causation. The debate between Humean and anti-Humean approaches to causation remains vigorous in contemporary philosophy. This persistence suggests that Hume identified fundamental tensions in our concept of causation that may be impossible to resolve through purely philosophical analysis. Part 7. The Skeptical Method that Destroyed Metaphysics. Hume's skeptical arguments represent perhaps the most systematic attack on metaphysical knowledge ever mounted. His method involves showing that our most fundamental concepts lack the rational foundations that philosophers have claimed for them. By subjecting concepts like causation, personal identity, external objects, and induction to empiricist analysis, Hume reveals that they rest on psychological habits rather than rational insight. This skeptical methodology has had enormous influence on subsequent philosophy, but it also raises fundamental questions about the nature and possibility of philosophical knowledge itself. Understanding Hume's skepticism illuminates persistent tensions between philosophical ambitions and empiricist constraints that continue to shape contemporary debates. These tensions reveal deep problems about whether philosophy can achieve the kind of foundational knowledge it has traditionally sought. Hume distinguishes between two types of skepticism that had been confused by earlier philosophers. Antecedent skepticism, exemplified by Descartes, attempts to doubt everything in order to find indubitable foundations for knowledge. Consequent skepticism, which Hume himself practices, examines the actual sources and nature of our beliefs to determine their rational status. Hume argues that antecedent skepticism is both impossible and useless. It is impossible because we cannot actually suspend all belief, and useless because even if we could, we would have no way to restart the process of belief formation. Consequent skepticism, by contrast, is both possible and valuable because it reveals the true nature of human belief and knowledge. Hume's consequent skepticism operates through what he calls the experimental method of reasoning about moral subjects. This method treats human beliefs and reasoning processes as natural phenomena to be studied empirically. Rather than asking whether our beliefs are rationally justified in some absolute sense, Hume asks how they actually arise and what psychological mechanisms sustain them. This naturalistic approach reveals that most of our fundamental beliefs rest on instinct, custom, and habit rather than reason. Belief in external objects, causal connections, and personal identity all arise from natural psychological processes that operate below the level of rational reflection. These beliefs are natural but not rational in the traditional philosophical sense. This analysis leads to what Hume calls mitigated skepticism. We cannot rationally justify our most basic beliefs, but we also cannot abandon them because they arise from natural and unavoidable psychological mechanisms. Hume recommends accepting this situation with philosophical humility. We should recognize the limitations of human reason while acknowledging the natural authority of instinct and habit. This position avoids both the dogmatism that claims rational justification for unjustifiable beliefs and the extreme skepticism that would undermine all belief and action. Mitigated skepticism represents a middle path that respects both the power and the limitations of human cognition. Yet critics argue that Hume's skeptical method is self-undermining. If reason cannot justify fundamental beliefs about causation and external objects, how can it justify Hume's own arguments against these beliefs? Hume's skeptical conclusions rest on sophisticated philosophical reasoning about the nature of ideas, impressions, and mental associations. But if reason is as limited as Hume claims, why should we trust this reasoning? The skeptical method seems to provide no special exemption for its own procedures. This creates what philosophers call the problem of self-refutation in skeptical arguments. Moreover, Hume's naturalistic approach faces the problem of normative force. Even if our beliefs arise from natural psychological mechanisms, this does not show that they are justified or that we should maintain them. The naturalistic description of belief formation does not itself provide normative guidance about which beliefs to accept. Critics argue that Hume illicitly moves from descriptive claims about how beliefs arise to normative claims about which beliefs are reasonable. This violates his own strictures against deriving aught from is. The tension between descriptive naturalism and normative epistemology remains unresolved in Hume's system. Contemporary philosophers have attempted various responses to these problems. Some embrace thoroughgoing naturalism that abandons traditional epistemological questions about justification in favor of psychological and sociological studies of belief formation. Others argue for evolutionary epistemology that grounds the reliability of natural belief forming mechanisms in their survival value. Still others defend various forms of pragmatism that justify beliefs in terms of their practical success rather than their rational foundations. Yet none of these approaches has achieved consensus. The fundamental tensions that Hume identified between reason and nature, between philosophical reflection and natural belief, continue to generate problems for any theory that attempts to combine empiricist methodology with normative epistemology. The persistence of these problems suggests that Hume may have identified irreducible tensions in the human condition itself. We are rational beings who demand justification for our beliefs, yet our most fundamental beliefs resist rational justification. We cannot abandon these beliefs without abandoning our humanity, yet we cannot rationally defend them without philosophical dishonesty. Hume's skepticism thus reveals not merely problems with particular philosophical theories, but tensions in the very nature of human cognition that may be impossible to resolve through philosophical argument alone. Part 8. The empiricist foundation that crumbled under analysis. Hume represents the culmination of British empiricism, carrying the doctrine to its logical conclusions with unprecedented rigour and honesty. Yet this very rigour reveals fatal problems with the empiricist programme that had dominated philosophy since Locke. Hume's analysis shows that pure empiricism leads inevitably to skepticism about fundamental features of reality and knowledge. This outcome suggests either that empiricism must be abandoned or that its skeptical conclusions must be accepted. Neither alternative has proved satisfactory to subsequent philosophers. creating persistent tensions that continue to shape contemporary debates about the nature and scope of human knowledge. Understanding these problems illuminates fundamental questions about the relationship between experience and knowledge that remain unresolved today. The Empiricist program begins with the seemingly modest claim that all knowledge derives from experience. Locke argued that the mind is initially a blank slate that receives ideas through sensation and reflection. Berkeley developed this approach by arguing that material substance is an unnecessary hypothesis, leaving only minds and their ideas. Hume completed the program by showing that even mental substance is unsupported by experience. This leaves only the flow of impressions and ideas connected by psychological associations. What began as a theory of knowledge becomes a radical metaphysical doctrine that eliminates most of what common sense takes to be real. Hume's copy principle embodies the core empiricist commitment. All simple ideas must be copied from corresponding simple impressions. This principle provides a test for meaningful concepts and a method for analyzing complex ideas. But when applied systematically, it leads to the elimination of most traditional philosophical concepts. The ideas of necessary connection, substantial self, external matter, and absolute space and time all fail the copy test. If we take empiricism seriously, these concepts must be rejected as meaningless or reconceived in purely psychological terms. Yet this reductive program faces immediate problems. The copy principle itself cannot pass its own test, since there is no impression of the relation between ideas and impressions. The principle appears to be a synthetic, a priori claim that violates empiricist methodology. Moreover, the psychological associations that replace metaphysical relations seem inadequate to account for the complexity and stability of human knowledge. If concepts like causation and identity are merely psychological habits, it becomes mysterious how they can support sophisticated scientific theories and practical reasoning. The gap between psychological description and epistemic justification becomes unbridgeable within a purely empiricist framework. The problem becomes acute when we consider the status of empiricism itself. Hume's arguments for empiricist conclusions rely on sophisticated philosophical reasoning that goes far beyond simple observation. The analysis of causation, personal identity and induction requires complex arguments about the nature of ideas, impressions and mental operations. But if empiricism is correct, these arguments themselves lack proper empirical foundation. The empiricist critique of reason appears to undermine the rational basis for empiricism itself. This creates a fundamental tension at the heart of the empiricist program. Contemporary philosophers have attempted various solutions to these problems. Logical empiricists try to reconstruct empiricism using formal logic and probability theory. This approach promised to maintain empiricist methodology while avoiding Humean skepticism through more sophisticated logical tools. But the logical empiricist program ultimately failed due to problems with the analytic-synthetic distinction, the theory-observation distinction, and the problem of induction. These failures suggest that the fundamental problems with empiricism cannot be solved through technical refinements alone. They point to deeper conceptual problems with the entire empiricist framework. Pragmatist philosophers have proposed replacing empiricist foundationalism with more holistic approaches to knowledge. Rather than seeking certain foundations in experience, pragmatists argue that beliefs should be evaluated in terms of their practical consequences and their coherence with other beliefs. This approach avoids some problems with traditional empiricism, but faces its own difficulties about relativism and the nature of truth. If beliefs are justified only by their practical success, it becomes unclear whether there are objective facts that beliefs can be true or false about. The pragmatist solution may eliminate skeptical problems only by abandoning realist commitments that seem essential to scientific and common sense thinking. These ongoing debates suggest that the problems Hume identified with empiricism remain as challenging today as they were in the 18th century. Part 9. The Moral Sentiment Theory under Philosophical Fire. Hume's moral philosophy represents a revolutionary attempt to ground ethics in human sentiment rather than reason or divine command. His theory argues that moral judgments express feelings of approval and disapproval rather than beliefs about objective moral facts. This sentimentalist approach has been enormously influential in contemporary metaethics, inspiring various forms of non-cognitivism and expressivism. Yet Hume's theory faces serious objections that challenge its adequacy as an account of moral judgment and moral knowledge. Understanding these critiques reveals persistent problems about the nature of moral evaluation and the possibility of moral objectivity that continue to divide philosophers today. These problems illuminate fundamental tensions between naturalistic approaches to ethics and our ordinary moral commitments. Hume's sentimentalist theory begins with his famous argument that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. He argues that reason alone cannot motivate action, while moral judgments necessarily have motivational force. Therefore, moral judgments cannot be purely rational, but must involve emotional responses. When we judge an action virtuous or vicious, we are expressing feelings of approval or disapproval that arise from contemplating the action from an impartial perspective. These moral sentiments are natural human responses that arise from our capacity for sympathy with others. Morality is thus grounded in human nature, rather than in objective moral facts or rational principles. The theory faces immediate problems about moral disagreement. If moral judgments merely express individual sentiments, how can we explain the widespread agreement about basic moral principles across cultures and historical periods? More problematically, how can we adjudicate moral disagreements if there are no objective moral facts to which we can appeal? Hume attempts to solve this problem by arguing that human nature is sufficiently uniform to generate convergence in moral sentiment when properly informed and impartially considered. But critics argue that this response is inadequate because it cannot explain persistent moral disagreements among equally informed and impartial observers. If sentiments vary across individuals and cultures, the theory seems to collapse into relativism. The motivational argument that supports sentimentalism also faces serious objections. Critics argue that the argument proves too much by implying that any judgment that motivates action must be non-cognitive. But this would include many ordinary factual judgments that clearly seem cognitive. For example, my belief that there is food in the refrigerator can motivate me to go to the kitchen, but this does not make the belief non-cognitive. Moreover, the argument seems to conflate motivational force with motivational necessity. Even if moral judgments typically motivate action, this does not show that they necessarily motivate action in all rational agents. The problem of moral weakness creates additional difficulties for Hume's theory. If moral judgments necessarily involve motivational sentiments, how can we explain cases where agents judge something morally required but fail to be motivated accordingly? A person might sincerely judge that helping others is morally obligatory while feeling no motivation to help. Hume attempts to explain such cases by distinguishing between calm and violent passions, arguing that moral judgments involve calm passions that can be overcome by violent ones. But critics argue that this response undermines the motivational argument for sentimentalism. If moral judgments can exist without effective motivation, the argument that they must be non-cognitive loses its force. Contemporary defenders of neo-Humean approaches have developed sophisticated responses to these objections. Expressivists argue that moral judgments express complex motivational attitudes rather than simple feelings of approval. These attitudes have logical and rational constraints that can explain moral argument and disagreement without appealing to objective moral facts. Non-cognitivists have developed elaborate theories about the logic of attitudes that attempt to capture the apparent objectivity of moral discourse within a broadly sentimentalist framework. Yet these approaches face their own problems about the nature of moral concepts and the possibility of moral knowledge. The debate between cognitivist and non-cognitivist approaches to ethics remains vigorous in contemporary philosophy. The fundamental problem may be that Hume's theory cannot adequately capture the phenomenology of moral judgment. When we make moral judgments, we typically experience ourselves as recognizing objective moral facts rather than merely expressing our sentiments. The theory requires us to accept that this experience is systematically misleading. But if our moral concepts are so thoroughly infected with false presuppositions about objectivity, it becomes unclear why we should trust any moral judgments at all. This leads to what philosophers call the error theory of moral judgment, which holds that all moral judgments are false because they presuppose non-existent objective moral facts. Neither sentimentalism nor error theory provides a satisfactory account of moral judgment that preserves both its motivational character and its apparent objectivity. Part 10. The religious skepticism that undermined natural theology. Hume's critique of natural religion represents perhaps the most systematic and devastating attack on rational theology ever produced. His arguments against the design argument, the cosmological argument, and the argument from miracles have shaped debates about religious belief for over 2 centuries. Yet Hume's religious skepticism raises fundamental questions about the relationship between philosophy and religious faith that remain unresolved today. Understanding these arguments reveals persistent tensions between rational inquiry and religious commitment that continue to challenge both believers and skeptics. These tensions illuminate broader questions about the scope and limitations of human reason when applied to ultimate questions about the nature of reality. The power and persistence of Hume's critique suggests that natural theology may face insuperable rational difficulties. Hume's critique begins with his empiricist analysis of religious concepts. Traditional theology posits a God with infinite attributes like omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness. But Hume argues that we can have no genuine idea of infinity because all our ideas are derived from finite impressions. The concept of an infinite being thus appears to be meaningless within an empiricist framework. Similarly, concepts like necessary existence, incorporeal substance, and simple divine unity all lack proper empirical foundation. If these concepts are meaningless, then traditional theological arguments collapse before they can even be properly formulated. The design argument receives Hume's most detailed critique in the dialogues concerning natural religion. This argument claims that the apparent design and complexity of the natural world provides evidence for an intelligent designer. Hume attacks this argument through multiple strategies. First, he argues that the analogy between natural objects and human artifacts is too weak to support the conclusion. Natural objects like plants and animals seem more like organic growths than like mechanical contrivances. Second, even if the analogy were valid, it would at most establish a finite architect rather than an infinite God. Moreover, the design argument faces the problem of evil. If the world exhibits evidence of intelligent design, it also exhibits evidence of suffering, waste, and apparent purposelessness. A perfectly good and omnipotent designer would presumably create a world free from these defects. The mixed character of the evidence suggests either that the designer is not perfectly good or not omnipotent, or that the design hypothesis is false. Hume argues that the design argument cannot overcome this fundamental difficulty. The world contains too much apparent disorder and suffering to support the hypothesis of perfect divine design. Hume's critique of miracles attacks another central pillar of natural theology. Traditional apologetics argues that miracles provide evidence for divine intervention and thus support religious belief. But Hume argues that a miracle, defined as a violation of natural law, can never be rationally credible. Natural laws are established by overwhelming empirical evidence, while miracle claims rest on human testimony that is subject to error, deception, and bias. No testimony can be strong enough to outweigh the evidence for natural laws, unless the falsity of the testimony would be more miraculous than the truth of the miracle itself. This condition is never met in practice, so rational persons should never believe miracle claims. The cosmological argument fares no better under Hume's analysis. This argument claims that every contingent being requires a cause, leading to the conclusion that there must be a necessary being that explains the existence of contingent reality. But Hume argues that the concept of necessary existence is meaningless. We can conceive of any being as non-existent without contradiction, so no being can be necessarily existent. Moreover, even if the argument established a first cause, it would not establish that this cause has the attributes traditionally assigned to God. The first cause might be material, finite, or morally indifferent to human welfare. Contemporary philosophers have attempted various responses to Hume's critique. Some argue that design arguments can be reformulated to avoid his objections by appealing to fine-tuning rather than apparent contrivance. Others defend Reformed epistemology that grounds religious belief in properly basic beliefs rather than in rational arguments. Still others embrace fideist approaches that separate faith from reason altogether. Yet none of these responses has achieved consensus even among religious philosophers. Hume's critique continues to pose fundamental challenges to any attempt to provide rational justification for religious belief. The broader significance of Hume's religious skepticism extends beyond particular theological arguments. His critique raises fundamental questions about the scope of human reason and the nature of religious faith. If reason cannot establish religious truths, this may show either that reason is limited or that religious claims are false. The choice between these alternatives depends on broader philosophical commitments about the relationship between reason, faith, and reality that cannot be settled by argument alone. Hume's critique thus reveals irreducible tensions between rational and religious approaches to ultimate questions that may be impossible to resolve through purely philosophical means. These tensions continue to shape contemporary debates about science and religion, atheism and theism, and the proper role of reason in human life. Part 11. Contemporary analytic philosophy's assault on Humean concepts. The rise of analytic philosophy in the 20th century brought sophisticated new tools to bear on Hume's arguments, revealing problems that earlier critics had not fully articulated. Advances in formal logic, philosophy of language, and conceptual analysis exposed fundamental flaws in Hume's empiricist methodology and skeptical conclusions. These contemporary critiques demonstrate that many problems Hume identified may result from conceptual confusions rather than deep metaphysical insights. Understanding these analytic responses reveals how philosophical progress can sometimes dissolve rather than solve traditional problems. Yet the analytic critique also raises questions about whether formal methods can adequately capture the intuitive concerns that motivated Hume's investigations. The tension between formal precision and philosophical insight remains a central issue in contemporary philosophy. The logical positivists attempted to reconstruct empiricism using formal logic and probability theory. They argued that Hume's problems arose from inadequate logical tools rather than fundamental difficulties with empiricism itself. The verification principle promised to eliminate meaningless metaphysical concepts while preserving the cognitive content of science and mathematics. Probability theory seemed to provide a solution to the problem of induction by showing how evidence can provide degrees of rational support for hypotheses. This technical approach initially appeared to vindicate empiricism against Humean skepticism while maintaining the anti-metaphysical spirit of his critique. The positivist program dominated analytic philosophy for several decades and seemed to offer a definitive resolution of problems that had plagued philosophy since Hume. Yet the positivist program ultimately collapsed under internal criticism. Quine's critique of the analytic-synthetic distinction undermined the foundation of logical empiricism. If there is no sharp distinction between analytic truths and synthetic truths, then the positivist framework cannot distinguish between logical and empirical claims. Kuhn's analysis of scientific revolutions challenged the idea that science progresses through simple accumulation of evidence. Goodman's new riddle of induction showed that formal probability theory cannot solve the problem of induction without substantive assumptions about natural kinds. These criticisms revealed that technical sophistication could not eliminate the fundamental problems Hume had identified. Contemporary philosophy of language has challenged Hume's assumptions about meaning and concepts. Hume's copy principle assumes that meaningful concepts must be traceable to sensory impressions. But Wittgenstein's analysis of language games suggests that meaning depends on use in social practices rather than on psychological association with impressions. Kripke's theory of rigid designation shows that some meaningful terms refer directly to their objects without the mediation of descriptive concepts. Putnam's arguments about natural kinds demonstrate that the meanings of scientific terms depend on causal relations to environmental features rather than on internal psychological states. These developments suggest that Hume's empiricist theory of concepts may be fundamentally misguided. Modal logic has provided new tools for analyzing concepts like necessity and possibility that Hume found problematic. Possible world semantics offers a framework for understanding necessity that does not depend on psychological feelings or habitual expectations. Necessary truths are those that hold in all possible worlds, while contingent truths hold only in some possible worlds. This approach preserves objective distinctions between necessary and contingent truths without requiring mysterious metaphysical connections. Contemporary philosophers have used modal logic to develop sophisticated theories of properties, laws of nature and causal relations that avoid many problems with Humean approaches. These technical developments suggest that Hume's skepticism about necessity may have been premature. Yet critics argue that analytic philosophy may have lost sight of the deeper concerns that motivated Hume's investigations. Formal methods excel at achieving precision and avoiding contradiction, but they may not capture the intuitive problems that drive philosophical inquiry. The possible world's framework for understanding necessity, while technically elegant, may simply relocate rather than solve the fundamental questions about the nature of modality. Similarly, externalist theories of meaning may preserve reference and knowledge claims while abandoning the epistemological concerns about justification that motivated empiricism. The analytic response to Hume may achieve technical sophistication at the cost of philosophical depth. This tension between rigour and relevance continues to generate debates about the proper methods and goals of philosophical inquiry. Part 12, More's Open Question and the Naturalistic Fallacy Critique. G.E. More's critique of Hume's moral philosophy introduced one of the most influential arguments in 20th century ethics. More argued that Hume's attempt to ground morality in natural facts commits what he called the naturalistic fallacy. This critique challenges not only Hume's specific sentimentalist theory, but any attempt to reduce moral concepts to naturalistic terms. More's arguments have shaped debates in meta-ethics for over a century, and continue to pose fundamental challenges to naturalistic approaches to ethics. Understanding More's critique reveals deep problems about the relationship between moral and non-moral concepts that remain unresolved in contemporary philosophy. These problems illuminate persistent tensions between our scientific understanding of human beings and our moral commitments that may be impossible to reconcile. More's argument centres on what he calls the open question test. For any proposed naturalistic definition of moral terms, we can always meaningfully ask whether things that satisfy the naturalistic definition are really good or right. If moral terms were synonymous with naturalistic terms, such questions would be obviously meaningless, like asking whether bachelors are really unmarried. But questions about whether pleasure is really good or whether approved actions are really right seem substantive and meaningful. This suggests that moral terms cannot be defined in purely naturalistic language. The open question argument thus supports what More calls the indefinability of moral concepts. More applies this argument specifically to Hume's sentimentalist theory. Hume argues that moral judgments express feelings of approval and disapproval rather than beliefs about objective moral properties. But More contends that we can meaningfully ask whether things we approve of are really good. This question would be meaningless if goodness simply consisted in being approved of. The meaningfulness of the question shows that goodness and approval are distinct concepts. Therefore, Hume's theory fails to capture the real meaning of moral terms. More broadly, More argues that the naturalistic fallacy infects all attempts to define moral terms in non-moral language. Whether the proposed definition appeals to pleasure, approval, evolutionary fitness, or divine commands, the open question argument applies equally. We can always meaningfully ask whether things that satisfy the proposed definition are really good or right. This suggests that moral concepts constitute a sui generis category that cannot be reduced to any naturalistic concepts. More concludes that goodness is a simple, unanalysable, non-natural property that can be apprehended only through moral intuition. This intuitionist approach preserves the autonomy of ethics against naturalistic reduction. Yet More's argument faces serious objections. Critics argue that the open question test proves too much by seeming to show that no substantive philosophical analysis can succeed. We can raise open questions about any proposed analysis, including mathematical and logical analyses that seem obviously correct. For example, we can ask whether things that are equiangular triangles are really equilateral triangles, but this does not show that these concepts are indefinable. The meaningfulness of a question may reflect ignorance or confusion rather than conceptual distinctness. Competent speakers who fully understand the relevant concepts may not find the questions genuinely open. Moreover, More's non-naturalism faces its own metaphysical and epistemological problems. If moral properties are non-natural, how do they relate to the natural world, and how can we have knowledge of them? More's talk of moral intuition seems to posit a mysterious faculty for apprehending non-natural facts. Critics argue that this approach makes morality too divorced from the natural world to play the action-guiding role that morality actually plays in human life. Non-naturalism may preserve the autonomy of ethics only by making moral knowledge impossible. This creates what philosophers call the placement problem for moral facts in a naturalistic worldview. Contemporary philosophers have developed various responses to More's challenge. Some argue that the open question argument can be answered by more sophisticated naturalistic analyses that capture the normative force of moral concepts. Others embrace non-cognitivist approaches that deny moral judgments express beliefs about moral properties at all. Still others defend quietist approaches that reject the entire framework of meta-ethical theorizing. Yet none of these approaches has achieved consensus. More's challenge continues to pose fundamental problems for any theory that attempts to integrate morality with a scientific understanding of human beings and their place in the natural world. Part 13. Wittgensteinian Dissolution of Humean Problems. Ludwig Wittgenstein's later philosophy offers a radical critique of the entire tradition of empirical philosophy that culminated in Hume. Rather than solving traditional philosophical problems, Wittgenstein argues that they arise from misunderstandings about the nature of language and meaning. His private language argument directly challenges Hume's assumption that meaningful concepts must be traceable to private mental impressions. This critique suggests that many problems Hume identified may be pseudo-problems that dissolve when we properly understand how language actually functions. Yet Wittgenstein's therapeutic approach raises its own questions about the nature and value of philosophical inquiry. The tension between traditional philosophical problems and Wittgensteinian dissolution remains a central issue in contemporary philosophy. Wittgenstein's private language argument attacks the foundational assumption of empiricism that meaningful concepts must be grounded in private mental experiences. Hume assumes that simple ideas are copied from simple impressions that are immediately present to consciousness. But Wittgenstein argues that no language can be logically private because meaning depends on public criteria for correct use. If the meaning of a concept depended on private mental associations, there would be no way to distinguish correct from incorrect applications of the concept. The criteria for correctness must be publicly available and socially shared. This undermines the entire empiricist program of grounding meaning in private mental contents. The rule-following considerations provide another challenge to Humean approaches. Hume explains our expectations about future events in terms of habits formed through past associations. But Wittgenstein argues that no amount of past associations can uniquely determine future applications of concepts. Any finite series of associations is compatible with indefinitely many different rules for continuing the series. The problem of rule following thus shows that habit and association cannot account for the normativity involved in concept use. Understanding a concept involves grasping a rule, but rules cannot be reduced to psychological regularities. Wittgenstein's analysis of language games offers an alternative to empiricist theories of meaning. Rather than deriving from associations with private impressions, concepts get their meaning from their role in complex social practices. Different language games involve different criteria for correct concept use and different ways of connecting language to the world. The language game of scientific description differs from the language game of moral evaluation or aesthetic judgment. Confusion arises when we assume that all meaningful discourse must conform to a single model of meaning or reference. Many traditional philosophical problems result from inappropriate extension of concepts across different language games. This approach suggests that Hume's skeptical problems may be based on conceptual confusions. The problem of induction assumes that inductive reasoning needs external justification in terms of correspondence to reality. But Wittgenstein suggests that inductive practices are simply part of our form of life and need no external justification. Asking for a general justification of induction is like asking for a justification of language itself. The question makes no sense, because justification always takes place within linguistic practices, not outside them. Similar arguments apply to Hume's problems about causation, personal identity, and external objects. Yet the Wittgensteinian approach faces serious objections. Critics argue that dissolving traditional problems may abandon legitimate philosophical concerns rather than solving them. Even if skeptical problems arise from conceptual confusions, there may be real underlying issues about the nature of knowledge, reality, and human beings that deserve philosophical attention. The therapeutic approach may be too quick to dismiss problems that point to genuine tensions in our conceptual schemes. Moreover, Wittgenstein's positive alternative may be insufficiently developed to handle complex questions about truth, knowledge, and reality. The appeal to forms of life and language games may simply relocate rather than resolve fundamental philosophical issues. Contemporary philosophers remain divided about the significance of Wittgensteinian criticisms. Some embrace broadly Wittgensteinian approaches that emphasize the social character of meaning and the diversity of linguistic practices. Others argue that Wittgenstein's insights can be incorporated into more traditional philosophical frameworks without abandoning the problems he criticized. Still others reject the Wittgensteinian approach as insufficiently rigorous and systematic. The debate reflects deeper disagreements about the nature and methods of philosophy itself. Whether Wittgenstein's approach represents a genuine advance over traditional empiricism or merely a sophisticated form of anti-intellectualism remains an open question in contemporary philosophy. Part 14. Evolutionary Epistemology's Challenge to Humean Skepticism. The development of evolutionary biology has provided new resources for responding to Hume's skeptical arguments about knowledge and induction. Evolutionary epistemologists argue that natural selection has shaped our cognitive mechanisms to track truth and detect environmental regularities. This provides a naturalistic explanation for the reliability of inductive reasoning that does not depend on a priori rational justification. The evolutionary approach promises to solve Hume's problems while maintaining a thoroughly naturalistic worldview. Yet this approach faces its own philosophical problems about the relationship between evolutionary success and truth. Understanding these issues reveals persistent tensions between descriptive and normative approaches to epistemology that may be irreconcilable. The basic evolutionary argument against Humean skepticism proceeds as follows. Organisms that were better at detecting environmental regularities and predicting future events would have had significant survival advantages over those with less reliable cognitive mechanisms. Natural selection would therefore have favoured the evolution of cognitive mechanisms that track environmental regularities accurately. Our capacity for inductive reasoning is the product of this evolutionary process. Therefore, we have good reason to trust inductive reasoning even if we cannot provide a priori rational justification for it. The evolutionary justification is naturalistic and does not depend on problematic assumptions about synthetic a priori knowledge or necessary connections in nature. This approach extends to other Humean problems. Our belief in external objects, causal relations, and personal identity over time can all be explained as adaptive responses to environmental challenges. Organisms that accurately represented their environment and their own persistence through time would have been more successful at survival and reproduction. The fact that these beliefs are universal among humans reflects their adaptive value rather than their rational justification. Evolutionary epistemology thus provides a naturalistic alternative to both rationalist foundationalism and Humean skepticism. It explains the reliability of our cognitive mechanisms without requiring mysterious a priori insights or accepting skeptical conclusions. Yet the evolutionary approach faces the problem of evolutionary debunking arguments. Even if natural selection favoured true beliefs in some domains, it may have favoured false but adaptive beliefs in others. Moral beliefs, religious beliefs, and beliefs about personal identity may be adaptive illusions that enhance survival without tracking truth. If evolutionary considerations can explain belief formation independently of truth, this may undermine rather than support the reliability of our cognitive mechanisms. The evolutionary approach threatens to become a universal acid that dissolves confidence in all our beliefs. This creates what philosophers call the problem of evolutionary debunking for any evolutionary account of human cognition. Moreover, the evolutionary argument may commit a genetic fallacy by confusing the origin of beliefs with their justification. Even if our cognitive mechanisms evolved because they were reliable, this does not show that they are actually reliable, or that beliefs produced by them are justified. The evolutionary history of our beliefs is relevant to their causal explanation, but not to their epistemic status. Critics argue that evolutionary epistemology conflates descriptive facts about belief formation with normative facts about epistemic justification. This confusion reflects a broader problem with naturalistic approaches to epistemology that attempt to eliminate the gap between description and normativity. The gap that Hume identified between is, and ought, may apply to epistemology as well as ethics. The reliability problem poses additional challenges for evolutionary epistemology. Natural selection operates on reproductive success, not truth per se. False beliefs could be adaptive if they motivated beneficial behaviours, while true beliefs could be maladaptive if they led to harmful actions. The connection between truth and adaptive success is contingent and variable across different domains and environments. Moreover, the environments in which our cognitive mechanisms evolved may be very different from contemporary environments where we apply them. Mechanisms that were reliable in ancestral environments may be unreliable when applied to abstract theoretical questions or novel technological challenges. Contemporary philosophers have developed various responses to these problems. Some argue that the connection between truth and adaptive success is stronger than critics suggest, at least for basic perceptual and inferential mechanisms. Others develop more modest versions of evolutionary epistemology that explain the origins of cognitive mechanisms without claiming to justify their outputs. Still, others argue that evolutionary considerations can provide prima facie justification that can be supplemented by other forms of evidence and reasoning. Yet none of these approaches has achieved consensus. The fundamental problem may be that evolutionary epistemology cannot bridge the gap between naturalistic explanation and normative justification that Hume's skepticism reveals. Part 15. Pragmatist rejection of Humean dualisms. American pragmatists developed a systematic critique of the dualisms that structure Hume's philosophy and generate his skeptical problems. Pragmatists argue that traditional distinctions between appearance and reality, subjective and objective, fact and value, create artificial problems that dissolve when we adopt a more practical approach to knowledge and inquiry. This pragmatist critique offers a radical alternative to both empiricist and rationalist approaches to philosophical problems. Yet pragmatism faces its own challenges about relativism, truth, and the nature of objective inquiry. Understanding the pragmatist response to Hume reveals fundamental questions about the relationship between philosophy and practice that continue to divide contemporary philosophers. These questions illuminate broader issues about whether philosophical problems can be dissolved through reconceptualization or require substantive theoretical solutions. John Dewey's critique of the spectator theory of knowledge directly challenges Humean empiricism. Hume assumes that knowledge involves a passive subject contemplating mental contents that may or may not correspond to external reality. This spectator model generates skeptical problems about how we can bridge the gap between internal representations and external objects. Dewey argues that this model fundamentally misunderstands the nature of knowledge and inquiry. Knowledge is not passive contemplation, but active engagement with environmental challenges. Inquiry is a process of problem-solving that transforms both the inquirer and the environment rather than simply representing pre-existing facts. William James's radical empiricism offers an alternative to traditional empiricist approaches. While Hume treats relations as mental constructions imposed on discrete impressions, James argues that relations are directly experienced. We experience continuity, change, and connection as immediately as we experience discrete sensory qualities. The stream of consciousness is not composed of atomic impressions, but is a continuous flow of experience that includes relational features. This eliminates the problem of how discrete mental atoms can be connected into coherent experience. Relational features need not be constructed by psychological association because they are given in experience itself. Charles Sanders. Peirce's pragmatic maxim provides a new approach to problems about meaning and truth. Rather than grounding meaning in psychological associations with impressions, Peirce argues that the meaning of concepts consists in their practical consequences. To understand what a concept means, we should consider what practical difference it would make if the concept applied rather than failed to apply. This pragmatic approach to meaning eliminates many traditional philosophical problems by showing that they make no practical difference. Questions that have no practical consequences are revealed as meaningless pseudo-problems rather than deep metaphysical issues. The pragmatic maxim thus provides a criterion for distinguishing genuine from spurious philosophical problems. This pragmatist approach dissolves many of Hume's skeptical problems. The problem of induction assumes that inductive reasoning needs external validation in terms of correspondence to objective reality. But pragmatists argue that the value of inductive reasoning lies in its practical success rather than its theoretical justification. Inductive methods that work in practice need no further justification. Similarly, questions about the existence of external objects or the nature of causal connections are meaningful only insofar as they make practical differences for inquiry and action. When interpreted pragmatically, these questions often dissolve or transform into empirical questions about the effectiveness of different practical strategies. Yet pragmatism faces serious objections about relativism and objectivity. If truth and knowledge are defined in terms of practical success, this seems to make them relative to particular purposes and contexts. What works for one group or in one situation may not work for others. This threatens to collapse into a form of relativism that abandons objective truth altogether. Critics argue that pragmatism cannot account for the objectivity that seems essential to scientific inquiry and rational discourse. Moreover, the appeal to practical consequences may be circular because judgments about what consequences are desirable or successful presuppose substantive values and beliefs. The problem of self-refutation also challenges pragmatist approaches. If the pragmatic maxim is correct, then its own meaning consists in its practical consequences. But the maxim itself seems to be a theoretical claim about the nature of meaning rather than a practical tool for solving specific problems. This suggests that pragmatism cannot be consistently applied to itself without generating paradox. Similar problems arise for other pragmatist doctrines that seem to make theoretical claims about the nature of truth, knowledge, and reality. The pragmatist critique of theory may undermine itself by presupposing theoretical commitments about the relationship between thought and practice. Contemporary neo-pragmatists have attempted to address these objections while preserving the insights of classical pragmatism. Some argue that pragmatism is better understood as a methodological approach rather than a substantive theory about truth and knowledge. Others develop sophisticated accounts of objectivity that are compatible with pragmatist commitments. Still others embrace the anti-theoretical implications of pragmatism and argue that philosophy should abandon the search for systematic theory altogether. Yet these developments have not resolved the fundamental tension between pragmatist critique and theoretical inquiry. The question of whether philosophical problems can be dissolved through practical reconceptualization or require substantive theoretical treatment remains open in contemporary philosophy. Part 16. Phenomenological challenges to empiricist assumptions. The phenomenological tradition, initiated by Edmund Husserl, offers a fundamental challenge to the empiricist assumptions that underlie Hume's philosophy. Phenomenologists argue that empiricism misunderstands the nature of experience by treating it as a collection of discrete mental contents, rather than as intentional consciousness directed toward objects. This intentional structure of consciousness undermines the atomistic approach that generates many of Hume's skeptical problems. The phenomenological critique reveals how empiricist methodology may distort rather than clarify the phenomena it attempts to analyze. Yet phenomenology faces its own challenges about objectivity, scientific knowledge, and the relationship between description and explanation. Understanding the phenomenological response to empiricism illuminates fundamental questions about the proper starting point and methodology for philosophical inquiry. Husserl's critique of psychologism directly challenges Hume's approach to logical and mathematical concepts. Hume attempts to explain our ideas of logical relations and mathematical truths in terms of psychological associations and habits. But Husserl argues that this confuses the psychological genesis of concepts with their logical content and validity. Logical truths are not empirical generalizations about psychological processes, but ideal relations that hold independently of any particular mental acts. The attempt to reduce logic to psychology commits a category mistake that undermines the normativity essential to logical reasoning. Similar arguments apply to mathematical concepts and other ideal objects that cannot be reduced to psychological phenomena without destroying their essential characteristics. The phenomenological concept of intentionality challenges Hume's representational theory of mind. Hume assumes that mental states are intrinsically contentless items that acquire content through causal relations to external objects or through resemblance relations to previous impressions. But phenomenologists argue that consciousness is essentially intentional, always directed toward objects that are given as having particular meanings and characteristics. There is no contentless consciousness that subsequently acquires content through external relations. The intentional structure is intrinsic to consciousness itself and cannot be explained in terms of causal or associative relations between discrete mental atoms. This eliminates the gap between mind and world that generates skeptical problems about knowledge of external objects. Husserl's analysis of temporal consciousness challenges Hume's atomistic account of experience. Hume treats experience as a sequence of discrete impressions that are connected only through psychological associations. But phenomenology reveals that temporal consciousness has a complex structure involving retention of the just past, primal impression of the now, and pretension toward the immediately upcoming. This temporal synthesis is not a construction imposed on atomic impressions, but is intrinsic to the structure of consciousness itself. We do not first have discrete momentary experiences that are then connected through memory and expectation. Rather, the experience of temporal flow and connection is primitive and cannot be reduced to associations between discrete mental contents. Martin Heidegger's analysis of being in the world offers an even more radical challenge to empiricist assumptions. Heidegger argues that the traditional subject-object distinction that structures empiricism is a derivative abstraction from our more primordial engagement with the world. We do not first encounter objects as mere things and then infer their practical significance through association and habit. Rather, we encounter objects primarily as equipment embedded in practical contexts of meaningful activity. The hammer is not first perceived as a physical object with certain sensory qualities and then associated with hammering activities. It is primordially encountered as a tool for hammering, and its physical properties become salient only when the practical context breaks down. This analysis suggests that many traditional philosophical problems arise from an illegitimate abstraction from our concrete engagement with the world. The problem of other minds assumes that we first have access only to our own mental states and must then infer the existence of other minds. But Heidegger argues that we are primordially with others in shared worlds of meaning and significance. The solitary subject contemplating private mental contents is not the starting point of analysis, but a derived abstraction that emerges only in special circumstances. Similarly, the problem of external objects assumes a gap between internal representations and external reality that does not exist in our primordial being in the world. These problems are artifacts of philosophical theorizing rather than genuine features of human existence. Yet phenomenology faces serious objections about its relationship to empirical science and objective knowledge. Critics argue that phenomenological description, however sophisticated, cannot replace empirical investigation of mental processes and their neural correlates. The intentional structure that phenomenologists describe may be a useful heuristic for psychological research rather than a fundamental metaphysical feature of consciousness. Moreover, phenomenology seems to privilege first-person description over third-person explanation in ways that may conflict with scientific methodology. The relationship between phenomenological analysis and empirical psychology remains controversial and unresolved. This raises broader questions about whether philosophical analysis can establish substantive conclusions about the nature of mind and reality that are independent of empirical investigation. Part 17. The Other Minds Problem in Humean Framework. Hume's empiricist framework generates a particularly acute version of the problem of other minds that has puzzled philosophers for centuries. If knowledge must be grounded in impressions, and we can only have impressions of our own mental states, how can we ever know that other people have minds at all? This problem reveals fundamental difficulties with any approach to knowledge that begins with private, first-personal experience. The other minds problem illustrates how empiricist methodology may lead to solipsistic conclusions that conflict with our most basic social and moral commitments. Understanding this problem and various attempts to solve it illuminates persistent tensions between individualistic and social approaches to knowledge and reality. These tensions continue to shape contemporary debates in philosophy of mind, epistemology, and ethics. The problem arises directly from Hume's copy principle and his theory of ideas. All meaningful concepts must be traceable to corresponding impressions, but we can never have impressions of other people's mental states. We observe other people's bodily movements and hear their verbal expressions, but these are merely external physical events. The mental states that supposedly cause these behaviors are never directly observable. Therefore, according to Hume's theory, we can have no meaningful concept of other minds. At best, we can form habits of expecting certain behaviors to follow certain circumstances, but this provides no knowledge of whether these behaviors are accompanied by conscious experiences. Hume attempts to solve this problem through his account of sympathy and the mechanism of idea enlivening. When we observe expressions of emotion in others, these perceptions become associated with memories of our own similar experiences. The association enlivens our ideas of those experiences, transforming them into impressions that approximate the emotional states we observe. This sympathetic process allows us to share in the mental lives of others and forms the foundation of moral judgment and social cooperation. Hume argues that sympathy provides a natural mechanism for transcending the boundaries of individual consciousness without requiring any mysterious rational insight into other minds. The solution is thoroughly naturalistic and depends only on psychological processes that can be empirically investigated. Yet this solution faces serious objections. Critics argue that sympathetic responses presuppose rather than explain knowledge of other minds. We can sympathize with others only if we already believe that their expressions indicate genuine mental states rather than mere behavioral patterns. The sympathetic mechanism cannot bridge the gap between external observation and internal mental states because it depends on assumptions about the connection between behavior and consciousness. Moreover, sympathetic responses vary dramatically across individuals and cultures, suggesting that they provide unreliable access to other minds. If sympathy is the foundation of our knowledge of others, this knowledge becomes relative to contingent psychological and social factors. The analogy argument offers an alternative approach to the other minds problem within an empiricist framework. We observe correlations between our own mental states and our own behaviours, and then infer by analogy that similar behaviours in others indicate similar mental states. This argument provides a rational basis for belief in other minds that does not depend on problematic sympathetic mechanisms. The analogy argument has been developed and refined by numerous philosophers as the most promising empiricist solution to the other minds problem. It preserves the methodological commitments of empiricism while providing some justification for our ordinary beliefs about other people's mental lives. The argument seems to offer a middle path between skeptical denial of other minds and uncritical acceptance of folk psychological assumptions. Yet the analogy argument faces devastating objections. The argument depends on a single case, the correlation between one's own mental states and behaviours, and attempts to generalize to all other cases. But no legitimate inductive argument can be based on a single instance. Moreover, the argument assumes that other people's bodies are sufficiently similar to one's own body to support analogical reasoning. This assumption cannot be justified within an empiricist framework because it presupposes knowledge of objective physical similarities that transcend private experience. The analogy argument thus fails to solve the other minds problem while remaining within empiricist constraints. Contemporary philosophers have developed various alternatives to traditional empiricist approaches to other minds. Simulation theorists argue that we understand others by using our own cognitive mechanisms to simulate their mental processes. Theory theorists contend that knowledge of other minds depends on tacit theoretical knowledge about the causal relations between mental states and behaviours. Direct perception theorists argue that we can directly perceive emotions and intentions in others' facial expressions and bodily movements. Each approach attempts to avoid the problems that arise when knowledge of other minds is conceived as inference from private, first personal experience. Yet none of these approaches has achieved consensus, and the fundamental problems may be irreconcilable within any framework that begins with individual consciousness and attempts to reach social knowledge through inference or projection. Part 18. Scientific Realism versus Humean Instrumentalism. Hume's analysis of causation and scientific knowledge leads to an instrumentalist interpretation of scientific theories that conflicts with the realist assumptions of most working scientists. If causal relations are merely regular successions of events rather than objective connections, then scientific laws describe observable patterns rather than underlying causal mechanisms. This instrumentalist approach treats scientific theories as useful tools for prediction and control rather than as descriptions of objective reality. The conflict between Humean instrumentalism and scientific realism raises fundamental questions about the nature and goals of scientific inquiry. Understanding this conflict illuminates persistent tensions between philosophical analysis and scientific practice that continue to divide philosophers of science. These tensions reveal deeper questions about whether philosophy can legitimately constrain or criticize the methods and assumptions of successful scientific research. Hume's regularity theory of causation eliminates objective causal powers and necessary connections from the natural world. Scientific laws become generalizations about observable patterns rather than descriptions of underlying causal mechanisms. The law of gravitation, for example, describes regular patterns of acceleration and attraction, but does not posit any gravitational force or mechanism that produces these patterns. Theoretical entities like forces, fields, and particles are useful fictions that help organize observations and generate predictions. They have no existence independent of their role in organizing experience and guiding prediction. This instrumentalist interpretation preserves the empirical content of science while eliminating metaphysical commitments about unobservable entities and processes. The instrumentalist approach extends to all theoretical concepts in science. Atoms, molecules, electrons, and other theoretical entities are not objective features of reality, but convenient ways of organizing and predicting observable phenomena. Scientific theories are neither true nor false, but more or less useful for achieving practical goals like prediction, control, and technological application. The success of science depends on its practical effectiveness rather than its correspondence to objective truth. This approach avoids metaphysical commitments about the ultimate nature of reality, while preserving the practical value of scientific knowledge. Instrumentalism thus offers a middle path between naive realism and complete skepticism about scientific knowledge. Yet scientific realists argue that instrumentalism cannot account for the success of science. If scientific theories were mere instruments for organizing observations, it would be miraculous that they achieve such remarkable predictive success across diverse domains. The best explanation for the success of science is that scientific theories are approximately true descriptions of objective reality. Theoretical entities like electrons and quarks exist independently of our observations and theories about them. Scientific progress consists in discovering increasingly accurate descriptions of these objective features of reality. The realist interpretation explains both the success of science and the convergence of independent lines of research towards similar theoretical conclusions. The realist argument from explanatory success poses a serious challenge to Humean instrumentalism. Scientific theories not only predict novel phenomena, but also explain why these predictions succeed. The explanation typically appeals to underlying causal mechanisms and theoretical entities that are not directly observable. If these entities and mechanisms do not exist, the explanatory success of science becomes inexplicable. Moreover, the fertility of scientific theories in generating new research programs and technological applications suggests that they capture genuine features of reality rather than mere observational regularities. The instrumentalist interpretation seems unable to account for the explanatory and heuristic power of successful scientific theories. Humean responses to scientific realism typically emphasize the historical instability of scientific theories. The history of science is littered with discarded theories that were once thought to be true descriptions of reality. Phlogiston, caloric, and luminiferous ether were all posited as real entities by successful scientific theories. The fact that these entities turned out not to exist suggests that current theoretical entities may also be eliminated by future scientific developments. The pessimistic meta-induction argues that since most past scientific theories have turned out to be false, current theories are also likely to be false. This supports an instrumentalist interpretation that avoids ontological commitments about theoretical entities. Contemporary philosophers of science have developed sophisticated versions of both realist and anti-realist positions. Structural realists argue that science tracks the mathematical structure of reality rather than the intrinsic nature of entities. Entity realists distinguish between observable entities and theoretical processes in ways that preserve some realist commitments while avoiding others. Constructive empiricists argue that science aims at empirical adequacy rather than truth about unobservable entities. Each position attempts to capture insights from both realist and instrumentalist approaches while avoiding their respective difficulties. Yet the fundamental tension between Humean skepticism about unobservables and scientific realism about theoretical entities remains unresolved in contemporary philosophy of science. Part 19. Feminist Critiques of the Reason-Emotion Divide. Feminist philosophers have mounted a sustained critique of the reason-emotion dichotomy that structures Hume's moral philosophy and much of the philosophical tradition. While Hume challenges the supremacy of reason over emotion, he maintains a sharp distinction between these capacities that feminist critics argue reflects and reinforces problematic gender hierarchies. The association of reason with masculinity and emotion with femininity has been used to exclude women from rational discourse and political participation. Feminist critiques reveal how seemingly neutral philosophical distinctions can encode implicit biases that have significant social and political consequences. Understanding these critiques illuminates broader questions about the relationship between philosophical theory and social power that have been neglected in traditional approaches to Hume's philosophy. These questions challenge philosophers to examine how their theoretical commitments may perpetuate rather than challenge existing forms of oppression. The historical association of reason with masculinity and emotion with femininity has deep roots in Western philosophy. From Plato through Descartes to Kant, philosophers have typically portrayed reason as the higher, more valuable human capacity, while treating emotions as lower, animal-like impulses that must be controlled by rational deliberation. This hierarchy has been systematically mapped onto gender distinctions, with men portrayed as naturally more rational and women as naturally more emotional. These associations have been used to justify the exclusion of women from higher education, political participation, and professional life. Even though Hume reverses the traditional hierarchy by making reason the slave of passion, he maintains the sharp distinction between these capacities that supports gendered thinking about human nature. Feminist critics argue that this distinction should be abandoned rather than simply inverted. Feminist epistemologists have challenged the ideal of detached, objective reasoning that underlies traditional approaches to knowledge. This ideal portrays knowledge as a view from nowhere that transcends particular social locations and emotional investments. But feminist philosophers argue that all knowledge is situated knowledge that reflects the social position and embodied experience of the knower. The pretense of detachment typically masks rather than eliminates bias by hiding the particular perspective from which knowledge claims are made. Moreover, emotions play positive epistemic roles by directing attention to morally and politically significant features of situations that purely rational analysis might overlook. Anger at injustice, empathy with suffering, and love for particular persons can provide epistemic access to moral and social realities that are invisible from a detached perspective. The care ethics tradition has challenged Humean approaches to moral psychology by emphasizing the role of caring relationships in moral development and judgment. While Hume grounds morality in impartial sympathy with the general interests of humanity, care ethicists argue that morality begins with particular caring relationships and the responsibilities they generate. The capacity for care develops through embodied practices of nurturing and responsiveness, rather than through abstract, rational reflection or impartial emotional response. This challenges both rationalist approaches that emphasize universal principles and sentimentalist approaches that emphasize impartial emotion. Care ethics suggests that moral judgment requires attention to context, relationships, and particular needs, rather than application of general principles or universal emotional responses. This approach questions whether morality can be adequately understood through any theory that abstracts from the embodied and relational character of human existence. Feminist philosophers have also criticized the individualistic assumptions that underlie traditional approaches to personal identity and moral agency. Hume's bundle theory treats the self as a collection of individual mental states connected by psychological associations. But feminist critics argue that this approach ignores the fundamentally relational character of human identity and agency. Selves are constituted through relationships with others rather than through private mental associations. The capacity for autonomous agency develops through caring relationships rather than through detachment from social connections. This relational approach to selfhood challenges both Humean bundle theories and Kantian theories of autonomous rational agency. These feminist critiques raise fundamental questions about the adequacy of traditional philosophical methods and assumptions. If philosophical theories systematically ignore or distort the experiences of women and other marginalized groups, this suggests that philosophy may need to be reconstructed rather than simply reformed. The feminist challenge to traditional philosophical distinctions like reason and emotion, individual and social, public and private, may require new approaches to philosophical theorizing that are more inclusive and less systematically biased. Yet critics argue that feminist philosophy may abandon the ideals of objectivity and universality that are essential to genuine philosophical knowledge. The tension between feminist critique and traditional philosophical methods remains unresolved in contemporary philosophy. This tension reflects broader questions about whether philosophy can acknowledge its social and political dimensions while maintaining its claim to produce objective knowledge about fundamental questions of human existence. Part 20. Cognitive Science Challenges to the Copy Principle. Contemporary developments in cognitive science pose fundamental challenges to Hume's copy principle and the entire empiricist theory of concept formation. Modern research reveals that the mind actively constructs representations rather than passively copying sensory impressions. This constructive view of cognition undermines the foundational assumption of Humean empiricism that all meaningful concepts must be traceable to prior sensory experiences. Understanding these scientific challenges reveals how philosophical theories about the mind can be constrained by empirical discoveries about cognitive processes. Yet the relationship between scientific findings and philosophical theories remains complex and controversial. These developments raise fundamental questions about whether empirical psychology can resolve traditional philosophical problems or whether philosophical analysis operates at a different level from scientific investigation. Research in developmental psychology reveals that concept formation is an active, constructive process rather than passive copying of sensory inputs. Children do not simply accumulate sensory experiences and form concepts through association and resemblance. Instead, they actively organize and interpret experience according to innate cognitive structures and developing theories about the world. The concept of physical object emerges early in development through active exploration and manipulation rather than through passive reception of visual impressions. Similarly, concepts of number, causation, and agency appear to involve innate cognitive structures that organize experience rather than emerging from experience through association. This suggests that many fundamental concepts are not copied from sensory impressions, but are constructed through the interaction of innate cognitive capacities and environmental input. Studies of perception reveal that even basic sensory experience involves active interpretation and construction. The visual system does not simply record incoming light patterns, but actively interprets ambiguous sensory data according to assumptions about lighting, surface properties, and object boundaries. Perceptual constancies like size and color constancy show that we perceive stable object properties despite massive variation in sensory stimulation. These constancies cannot be explained through simple association or copying because they require the visual system to discount irrelevant variation and extract invariant features. Moreover, phenomena like change blindness and inattentional blindness show that conscious perception is highly selective and reconstructive rather than a faithful copy of sensory input. This undermines the empiricist assumption that impressions provide a passive, accurate record of environmental stimulation. Research in categorization reveals that concept formation involves theory like structures rather than simple resemblance or association. People do not categorize objects according to overall similarity or shared perceptual features, but according to theoretically relevant properties and causal relations. The concept of water includes H2O molecules in distant galaxies that share no perceptual features with familiar instances of water. Similarly, concepts of biological kinds like tiger or lemon depend on assumptions about essential properties and causal powers rather than on clusters of observable features. This suggests that conceptual content is determined by implicit theories about the nature of the world rather than by associations with sensory impressions. The theory of concepts directly contradicts the copy principle by making theoretical knowledge prior to rather than derived from sensory experience. Studies of language acquisition provide additional challenges to empiricist approaches to concept formation. Children acquire complex linguistic concepts and grammatical structures that far outstrip their sensory experience. The poverty of stimulus argument shows that children could not learn the rules of grammar from exposure to linguistic input alone, because the input is too limited and contains too many errors. This suggests that linguistic concepts depend on innate cognitive structures rather than on copying from sensory experience. Moreover, the ease and universality of language acquisition across diverse cultural environments suggests that humans have specialized cognitive mechanisms for language learning that are not reducible to general associative learning mechanisms. This challenges the empiricist assumption that all concept formation can be explained through the same basic psychological processes of association and habit formation. Yet defenders of empiricist approaches argue that cognitive science findings can be accommodated within a suitably updated empiricist framework. Connectionist models show how complex cognitive phenomena can emerge from simple associative learning mechanisms operating on rich environmental input. Statistical learning mechanisms can extract complex patterns from sensory experience without requiring innate theoretical knowledge. Moreover, the active character of perception and cognition is compatible with empiricism if it is understood as active exploration and testing of environmental contingencies rather than passive reception of information. Some neo-empiricists argue that cognitive science supports rather than undermines empiricist approaches by revealing the sophisticated mechanisms through which experience shapes concept formation. The debate between empiricist and nativist approaches to cognition remains vigorous in contemporary cognitive science and philosophy of mind. The relationship between scientific findings and philosophical theories raises broader methodological questions. Even if cognitive science shows that the copy principle is false as a psychological theory, this may not refute it as a normative theory about how concepts should be formed or validated. The philosophical question about the source of conceptual content may be distinct from the psychological question about the mechanisms of concept acquisition. Moreover, cognitive science findings are themselves subject to interpretation and may not definitively resolve traditional philosophical disputes. The complex relationship between descriptive and normative approaches to concept formation continues to generate debate about the proper relationship between philosophy and empirical psychology. Understanding this relationship is crucial for evaluating the significance of scientific challenges to traditional philosophical theories. Part 21. Modal Logic and the Necessity Problem. The development of modal logic in the 20th century provided new tools for analysing concepts of necessity and possibility that Hume found problematic. Possible world semantics offers a framework for understanding necessity that does not depend on psychological feelings or mysterious metaphysical connections. This technical approach promised to solve Hume's problems about necessary connection while preserving objective distinctions between necessary and contingent truths. Yet the modal realist interpretation of possible worlds faces its own metaphysical difficulties that may be as problematic as the traditional concepts Hume criticized. Understanding the modal approach to necessity reveals both the power and the limitations of formal methods for resolving traditional philosophical problems. These issues illuminate persistent tensions between technical precision and metaphysical plausibility that continue to challenge contemporary philosophy. Hume's critique of necessary connection focuses on the claim that we have no impression of any power or force that necessitates one event to follow another. All we observe is constant conjunction between types of events, not any necessary connection that guarantees the effect must follow the cause. This leads Hume to conclude that necessity is a projection of mental habit rather than an objective feature of the world. Modal logic provides an alternative analysis by defining necessity in terms of truth across possible worlds, rather than in terms of psychological or metaphysical connections. A statement is necessarily true if it is true in all possible worlds, contingently true if it is true in some but not all possible worlds, and impossible if it is true in no possible worlds. This approach preserves objective modal distinctions without requiring problematic metaphysical commitments about powers, forces, or causal necessities. The possible worlds framework can be applied to analyze various types of necessity that Hume found problematic. Logical necessity corresponds to truth in all logically possible worlds, while natural or nomological necessity corresponds to truth in all worlds, where the laws of nature are the same as in the actual world. Causal statements can be analyzed using counterfactual conditionals that are evaluated across possible worlds. For example, the claim that striking a match caused it to light can be analyzed as the counterfactual that if the match had not been struck, it would not have lit. This counterfactual is true if in the nearest possible worlds where the match is not struck, it does not light. The modal approach thus provides precise tools for analyzing causal and modal concepts without appealing to mysterious necessary connections or psychological projections. Yet the modal approach faces serious questions about the nature and existence of possible worlds. David Lewis developed a realist interpretation according to which possible worlds are concrete physical realities that are as real and as detailed as the actual world. On this view, there are worlds where dinosaurs never became extinct, where World War II never occurred, and where the laws of physics are different from actual laws. These worlds exist independently of our language and thought about them, and provide objective truth conditions for modal and counterfactual statements. But modal realism faces the incredulous stare objection that it posits an infinite number of concrete worlds containing unimaginable amounts of suffering and moral horror. Moreover, if all possible worlds are equally real, it becomes unclear what makes the actual world special or why we should care about what happens in it. Alternative interpretations of possible worlds attempt to avoid the metaphysical costs of modal realism while preserving the technical benefits of possible world semantics. Abstractionist approaches treat possible worlds as abstract objects, like sets of propositions or states of affairs, rather than as concrete physical realities. Linguistic approaches treat possible world talk as a useful fiction that helps us organize our modal concepts without ontological commitment to the worlds themselves. Combinatorial approaches analyze possible worlds as recombinations of actual elements rather than as sui generis entities. Each approach attempts to preserve the formal utility of possible world semantics while avoiding problematic metaphysical commitments. Yet none of these approaches has achieved consensus, and the interpretation of possible worlds remains controversial in contemporary philosophy. The relationship between modal logic and metaphysics raises broader questions about the significance of formal methods for traditional philosophical problems. Even if possible world semantics provides a coherent formal treatment of modal concepts, this may not resolve the underlying metaphysical questions about the nature of necessity that motivated Hume's critique. The formal apparatus may simply relocate rather than solve the fundamental problems about what makes modal truths true. Moreover, the application of modal logic to natural language involves significant idealization and abstraction that may distort rather than clarify ordinary modal concepts. The relationship between formal semantics and natural language remains complex and controversial. These issues reflect broader questions about whether formal methods can provide substantive solutions to traditional philosophical problems or merely offer new ways of expressing the same underlying puzzles. Part 22. Social Construction versus Natural Belief. Contemporary social constructionist approaches offer a radical alternative to Hume's naturalistic account of fundamental beliefs about causation, external objects, and personal identity. While Hume explains these beliefs as products of natural psychological mechanisms, social constructionists argue that they are cultural artifacts that vary across societies and historical periods. This constructionist challenge suggests that what Hume takes to be universal features of human nature may actually be contingent products of particular social and cultural arrangements. Understanding this debate illuminates fundamental questions about the relationship between nature and culture in human cognition and belief formation. These questions have significant implications for philosophy, anthropology, and psychology that extend far beyond the interpretation of Hume's particular theories. The debate reflects broader tensions between universalist and relativist approaches to human nature that continue to divide contemporary scholars. Social constructionists argue that fundamental categories like causation, objectivity, and personal identity are not natural givens, but are constructed through social practices and cultural transmission. Different cultures organize experience using different categorical schemes that reflect their particular historical development and social needs. Western concepts of linear causation, for example, may not be universal, but may reflect the particular historical development of mechanistic science and industrial technology. Other cultures may organize causal thinking using different models like reciprocal causation, circular causation, or spiritual influence that are equally valid ways of making sense of experience. If constructionists are correct, then Hume's naturalistic explanations of belief formation miss the crucial role of social and cultural factors in shaping human cognition. What appears to be natural human psychology may actually be culturally specific ways of organizing and interpreting experience. The anthropological evidence for cultural variation in basic cognitive categories appears to support constructionist claims. Different cultures have different concepts of personal identity, with some emphasizing individual continuity and others emphasizing social roles or spiritual connections. Concepts of causation vary from mechanistic approaches that emphasize efficient causation to animistic approaches that emphasize intentional or spiritual causation. Even basic perceptual categories like color terms vary significantly across cultures in ways that affect how speakers perceive and remember colors. This suggests that what Westerners take to be natural categories may actually be cultural constructions that are transmitted through language and social practice. The universality that Hume claims for basic human beliefs may reflect the parochial perspective of his particular cultural background, rather than genuine features of human nature. Historical studies of science provide additional support for constructionist approaches. Concepts that seem natural and inevitable to contemporary thinkers often turn out to have complex historical origins and to have varied significantly across different periods. The modern concept of scientific objectivity, for example, emerged in the 19th century through particular social and institutional developments rather than through the discovery of timeless methodological truths. Similarly, concepts of mental illness, childhood and sexuality have varied dramatically across historical periods in ways that suggest they are social constructions rather than natural kinds. If basic scientific and social categories are historically contingent, this supports the constructionist claim that fundamental cognitive categories are also culturally variable. The apparent naturalness of Western categories may reflect their institutionalization and cultural dominance rather than their correspondence to objective features of reality. Yet defenders of naturalistic approaches argue that social constructionism overstates the significance of cultural variation. While surface features of belief systems vary across cultures, the underlying psychological mechanisms that generate beliefs may be universal products of human evolution. All cultures recognize some distinction between appearance and reality, develop causal concepts for predicting and explaining events, and maintain concepts of personal identity over time. The universality of these basic cognitive achievements suggests that they reflect universal features of human psychology rather than contingent cultural constructions. Moreover, the existence of cultural variation does not imply that all cultural constructions are equally valid or that there are no objective constraints on successful belief systems. Some ways of organizing experience may be more effective than others for achieving human goals like survival, cooperation, and understanding. The debate between naturalistic and constructionist approaches reflects deeper philosophical disagreements about realism, relativism, and the nature of human knowledge. Naturalistic approaches typically assume that there are objective features of reality that constrain successful belief systems and that human psychology has evolved to track these features. Constructionist approaches typically emphasize the role of power, interest, and contingent historical development in shaping what counts as knowledge or reality within particular communities. These disagreements cannot be resolved through empirical evidence alone. because they involve fundamental philosophical commitments about the nature of truth, objectivity, and human knowledge. The persistence of this debate suggests that it may reflect irreducible tensions in human thinking about the relationship between mind and world that cannot be eliminated through theoretical progress. Understanding these tensions is crucial for evaluating the contemporary significance of Hume's naturalistic approach to human belief and knowledge. Part 23. Externalist epistemology against Humean internalism. Contemporary externalist approaches to epistemology pose fundamental challenges to the internalist assumptions that structure Hume's theory of knowledge and justification. Hume assumes that justification depends on factors that are internal to the believer's perspective, such as sensory impressions, associative relations, and habits of expectation. Externalists argue that justification depends primarily on external factors like causal relations between beliefs and their objects or the reliability of belief-forming processes. This externalist approach promises to solve many of the skeptical problems that arise from Humean internalism while preserving realistic commitments about knowledge and truth. Yet externalism faces its own problems about the nature of justification and its relationship to the believer's perspective. Understanding this debate illuminates fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge and justification that continue to divide contemporary epistemologists. Hume's approach to knowledge assumes that justification must be accessible to the believer through introspection and rational reflection. For a belief to be justified, the believer must have access to evidence or reasons that support the belief and must be able to recognize the force of this evidence. This internalist constraint generates skeptical problems when beliefs about the external world, other minds, or inductive generalizations cannot be justified by evidence that is internal to the believer's perspective. The problem of induction arises because we cannot introspectively access reasons that would justify beliefs about future events or unobserved regularities. Similarly, the problem of external objects arises because we cannot introspectively access evidence that would justify beliefs about mind-independent reality. The internalist approach thus leads inexorably to skeptical conclusions about the possibility of knowledge in these domains. Reliabilist theories of knowledge offer an externalist alternative that avoids these skeptical problems. According to reliabilism, a belief is justified if it is produced by a reliable belief-forming process, regardless of whether the believer has access to evidence of this reliability. Perceptual beliefs about external objects are justified if perception is a reliable process for forming true beliefs about the environment. Inductive beliefs about future events are justified if inductive reasoning is a reliable process for forming true beliefs about unobserved regularities. The believer need not have access to evidence of reliability for the belief to be justified. This externalist approach allows for widespread knowledge of external objects and inductive generalizations without requiring the kind of internal justification that generates Humean skepticism. Causal theories of knowledge provide another externalist approach that challenges Humean assumptions. According to causal theories, a belief constitutes knowledge if it is caused in the right way by the fact that makes it true. My belief that there is a tree in front of me constitutes knowledge if it is caused by the presence of the tree through appropriate causal chains involving light reflection and visual processing. The justification for the belief consists in this causal relation rather than in internal evidence or reasons accessible to the believer. This approach eliminates the gap between mind and world that generates skeptical problems in internalist approaches. If knowledge consists in appropriate causal relations rather than in internal justification, then knowledge of external objects becomes unproblematic. Yet, externalist approaches face the generality problem and the problem of relevant alternatives. Reliabilist theories must specify the relevant process type and reference class for evaluating reliability, but there seem to be no principled ways to make these specifications. Any particular belief is the product of many different processes operating at different levels of generality, and the reliability of the belief depends on which process type is considered relevant. Similarly, causal theories must specify which causal chains are appropriate for knowledge. But this specification seems to require appeal to internalist notions of evidence and justification. The externalist approach may not eliminate the need for internalist constraints, but may simply relocate them to a different level of analysis. Moreover, externalist theories seem to allow for knowledge in cases where the believer lacks any good reasons for the belief, which conflicts with intuitive requirements for rational justification. The new evil demon problem poses an additional challenge to externalist approaches. Imagine a believer who is systematically deceived by an evil demon, but whose beliefs are produced by processes that would be reliable in normal environments. Externalist theories seem to imply that such a believer lacks knowledge despite having beliefs that are internally indistinguishable from knowledge. But this conflicts with the intuition that internal duplicates should have the same epistemic status. Critics argue that this shows the inadequacy of purely externalist approaches to justification and knowledge. The problem suggests that any adequate theory of knowledge must incorporate both externalist and internalist elements, but the proper relationship between these elements remains controversial in contemporary epistemology. Part 24. Virtue Ethics Revival against Humean Sentimentalism. The revival of virtue ethics in contemporary moral philosophy poses significant challenges to Hume's sentimentalist approach to morality. While Hume grounds moral judgment in feelings of approval and disapproval, virtue. Ethicists argue that morality is fundamentally about character traits and human flourishing. This neo-Aristotelian approach emphasizes the development of virtuous character through moral education and practice rather than the expression of moral sentiments through impartial sympathy. The virtue ethics critique suggests that Hume's sentimentalism may miss the most important features of moral life by focusing on judgment rather than on action and character development. Understanding this critique illuminates fundamental questions about the nature of morality and moral philosophy that continue to divide contemporary ethicists. These questions reveal persistent tensions between psychological and normative approaches to ethics that may be irreconcilable within any single theoretical framework. Virtue ethicists argue that Hume's focus on moral judgment reflects a modern obsession with rules and principles that distorts the true nature of moral life. For Aristotelians, morality is primarily about becoming a certain kind of person rather than about following rules or expressing appropriate feelings. The central question is not what acts are right or wrong, but what character traits contribute to human flourishing and how these traits can be developed through moral education. Virtues like courage, honesty, and compassion are excellent character traits that enable their possessors to live well and contribute to their communities. The development of virtue requires practical wisdom that cannot be reduced to the application of general principles or the expression of universal sentiments. Each situation requires sensitivity to particular features and context that can only be developed through experience and moral education. The virtue ethics approach challenges Hume's assumption that moral judgments must be universal and impartial. Hume argues that moral sentiments must be corrected for bias and partiality by adopting a general point of view that considers the interests of all affected parties. But virtue ethicists argue that this impartiality requirement misunderstands the essentially particular and contextual character of moral life. Moral agents have special obligations to family members, friends and community members that cannot be reduced to impartial concern for universal human welfare. The virtue of loyalty requires favouring particular people and causes over others in ways that violate requirements of impartiality. Moreover, the development of virtue requires attachment to particular communities and traditions that provide the context for moral education and practical wisdom. The neo-Aristotelian approach also challenges Hume's naturalistic reduction of virtue to usefulness and agreeableness. Hume argues that we approve of character traits because of their pleasant and useful consequences for ourselves and others. But virtue ethicists argue that this instrumentalist approach misses the intrinsic value of virtue and the internal connection between virtue and human flourishing. Virtues are not merely means to external goods, but are themselves constituents of the good life for human beings. The brave person does not act courageously merely because courage produces good consequences, but because courage is an excellence that partially constitutes human flourishing. This teleological approach grounds virtue in human nature and human good rather than in psychological responses of approval and disapproval. Contemporary virtue ethicists have developed sophisticated responses to standard objections about relativism and action guidance. Critics argue that virtue ethics cannot provide action guidance because different cultures have different concepts of virtue and because virtuous people sometimes disagree about what to do. But virtue ethicists respond that moral disagreement exists in all approaches to ethics, and that virtue concepts show significant cross-cultural convergence. Moreover, the goal of moral theory is not to provide algorithmic decision procedures, but to help agents develop the character traits and practical wisdom needed for moral life. The complexity and context sensitivity of moral life cannot be captured by any simple theoretical framework, whether utilitarian, deontological or sentimentalist. Virtue ethics embraces this complexity rather than attempting to reduce it to general principles or universal sentiments. Yet Hume's sentimentalist approach offers important insights that virtue ethics may not adequately capture. Hume's emphasis on sympathy and fellow feeling highlights the emotional dimensions of moral life that are sometimes neglected in virtue approaches focused on character traits and practical wisdom. The capacity for moral emotion may be a necessary component of virtuous character that cannot be reduced to intellectual understanding or habitual action. Moreover, Hume's naturalistic approach provides resources for understanding the psychological mechanisms that underlie moral development and moral motivation. Virtue ethics may need to incorporate insights from moral psychology about the role of emotion, sympathy, and social learning in character development. The relationship between Humean and Aristotelian approaches to ethics may be complementary rather than competitive, with each approach illuminating different aspects of moral life that are missed by the other. Part 25. Contemporary Naturalism's Enduring Hume Problem. Contemporary naturalistic approaches to philosophy continue to struggle with problems that David Hume first identified over 2 centuries ago. Despite enormous advances in science and formal methods, the fundamental tensions between descriptive and normative inquiry that Hume revealed remain as challenging today as they were in the 18th century. Modern naturalists attempt to integrate philosophical inquiry with scientific knowledge, while preserving normative dimensions of human life. But this integration faces persistent difficulties about the relationship between fact and value, description and prescription. Understanding these contemporary struggles illuminates the enduring significance of Hume's philosophical insights and the persistent challenges they pose for any systematic worldview. The fact that these problems remain unresolved after centuries of sophisticated theoretical development suggests that they may reflect fundamental features of human thought and reality that cannot be eliminated through philosophical progress. This conclusion would vindicate Hume's skeptical approach while challenging the ambitions of systematic philosophy to provide comprehensive accounts of knowledge, morality, and human nature. Scientific naturalism attempts to understand human beings and their cognitive capacities as natural phenomena that can be studied using the methods of empirical science. This approach promises to eliminate the mystery and speculation that have plagued traditional philosophy by grounding philosophical theories in empirical knowledge about psychology, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology. Naturalistic epistemology studies belief formation and knowledge acquisition as psychological processes rather than as abstract logical relations. Naturalistic ethics examines moral judgment and moral motivation as biological and cultural adaptations rather than as responses to objective moral facts. This scientific approach to philosophical problems initially appears to vindicate Hume's naturalistic insights while avoiding his skeptical conclusions. If human cognitive capacities can be understood scientifically, then skeptical worries about their reliability may be answered through empirical investigation rather than a priori argument. Yet, scientific naturalism faces modern versions of the problems that generated Hume's skepticism. The problem of induction persists in contemporary philosophy of science as the problem of underdetermination and the pessimistic meta-induction about scientific theories. If scientific theories are underdetermined by evidence, and if past scientific theories have mostly turned out to be false, how can we be confident in current scientific knowledge? The naturalistic approach seems to undermine itself by revealing the contingency and fallibility of the scientific methods on which it depends. Moreover, evolutionary approaches to epistemology face debunking arguments that threaten to undermine confidence in human cognitive capacities. If our beliefs are products of evolutionary processes aimed at survival rather than truth, why should we trust them to provide accurate representations of reality? The is-ought problem also persists in contemporary naturalistic approaches to ethics. Even if science can explain the origins and functions of moral beliefs, this does not show that any particular moral beliefs are justified or that moral facts exist. Evolutionary approaches to ethics face the is-ought problem in explaining how descriptive facts about the evolution of moral sentiments can justify normative conclusions about how we ought to act. Similarly, neuroscientific approaches to moral judgment face the problem of explaining how facts about brain activity can determine what is morally right or wrong. The naturalistic approach may explain away morality rather than providing a naturalistic foundation for moral knowledge. This threatens to lead to moral nihilism or relativism rather than to a scientifically grounded moral theory. The hard problem of consciousness poses additional challenges for naturalistic approaches to the mind. Even if neuroscience can explain the functional aspects of mental processes, it may not be able to explain the subjective, experiential aspects of consciousness. This explanatory gap between physical processes and conscious experience recalls Hume's skepticism about necessary connections between distinct events. The persistence of the hard problem suggests that scientific naturalism may not be able to provide complete accounts of mental phenomena that include both their objective and subjective aspects. If consciousness cannot be fully naturalized, this may limit the scope of scientific approaches to philosophical problems and vindicate aspects of Hume's skepticism about the powers of human reason. The continuing mystery of consciousness reveals fundamental limitations in our scientific understanding of the natural world that includes ourselves. Contemporary debates about scientific realism, moral realism and mental causation all reflect persistent Humean themes about the relationship between appearance and reality, fact and value, mind and world. The sophistication of contemporary theoretical apparatus has not eliminated these fundamental tensions, but has revealed new dimensions of their complexity and persistence. This suggests that Hume may have identified permanent features of the human condition rather than temporary puzzles that can be solved through theoretical progress. We may be beings who necessarily think in terms of objective truth, moral obligation, and mental causation, while being unable to provide ultimate rational justification for these ways of thinking. If this is correct, then philosophy may need to adopt the kind of mitigated skepticism that Hume recommended rather than pursuing systematic theoretical solutions to traditional problems. The enduring relevance of Hume's insights suggests that philosophical maturity may require accepting fundamental limitations in human knowledge while continuing to engage with the problems that reveal these limitations. In examining these 25 parts of critique against David Hume's philosophy, we see how his revolutionary insights continue to challenge fundamental assumptions about knowledge, morality, and human nature. From the 18th century critiques of Reid and Kant to contemporary debates in cognitive science and analytic philosophy, Hume's arguments remain as provocative and problematic today as they were centuries ago. This persistence suggests that Hume identified deep tensions in human thought that may be permanent features of our condition rather than problems awaiting theoretical solution. Understanding these critiques and the ongoing debates they generate is essential for anyone seeking to grapple seriously with fundamental questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and human existence.